There was a time when justice wasn't about truth. It was about power. Imagine a world without lawyers, without trials, without mercy, where guilt wasn't proven by evidence, but by fear, where the law was not written to protect the weak, but to remind them who held the power to kill. Long before modern courts and judges in black robes, there were kings gods on earth who decided life and death with a single gesture. Their word was law, their anger a sentence. In the scorching sands of Mesopotamia, in the temples of Egypt, in the marble halls of Rome, and the icy castles of medieval Europe, justice had another name. It was called punishment. Some laws were written in stone, others whispered by priests in the dark, but all carried the same message: obedience or death. They called it civilization. But beneath the gold and glory, humanity was being ruled by fear, by laws so cruel, so unthinkable, that even execution was considered mercy. And these weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully designed tools of control, engineered to break the human spirit. A man who stole bread could lose his hands. A woman accused of witchcraft could burn alive. A child who disobeyed a ruler could watch his entire family erased from history. Justice was not blind. It was watching and waiting. So tonight, we open the oldest book in human history. The one written not in ink, but in blood. Because if you want to know the truth about civilization, you have to look at what it feared the most: disobedience. This is the dark history of law. When justice was death, before Rome rose, before Athens dreamed of democracy, there was Babylon, the city that built its laws in stone. Its ruler, Hammurabi, reigned nearly 4,000 years ago, and what he left behind would become the foundation for justice across the ancient world. The Code of Hammurabi. It wasn't just a list of crimes and punishments. It was a declaration that power was divine, that order could only exist through fear. The code was carved into a black basalt stele, taller than a man, heavy as guilt itself. At the top, it showed the king standing before Shamash, the god of justice, receiving his authority to rule. Below, 282 laws, each one an equation of pain. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It sounds balanced, fair even, but the truth was far from equal. If a nobleman broke the bone of another nobleman, his own bone was broken in return. But if he broke the bone of a slave, he simply paid a fine. Justice, even then, was never blind. It looked up, never down. There was a law for every act of life. If a builder's house collapsed and killed its owner, the builder was executed. If a doctor caused a noble to die, his hands were cut off. If a woman insulted her husband, she was drowned. And if a son struck his father, his hands were severed in front of the family. Hammurabi's code didn't just punish, it taught fear. People obeyed not because they were good, but because the price of disobedience was unbearable. In Babylon, justice was a performance, a reminder that power came from above, and mercy was not of this world. Justice was not meant to heal. It was meant to remind you who could hurt you. While Babylon ruled through terror, Egypt ruled through divinity. Every law, every judgment was believed to come from Mat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. To defy the law wasn't just a crime, it was blasphemy. It meant you had disturbed the universe itself. Egyptian courts were held in temple halls, where priests sat beside judges, their faces half hidden in shadow. Each accused stood barefoot, hands raised in surrender before the god statues, watching from the walls. There was no presumption of innocence. If you were accused, you were already guilty. The question was simply how the gods would punish you. The sentences were elaborate, ritualistic. Those who stole from temples had their tongues cut out. Murderers were impaled alive, their bodies left on display along the Nile as warnings to the living. Adulterers were burned. Traitors were forced to take their own lives. But the Egyptians took punishment one step further, into the afterlife. In death, your heart would be weighed by Mat herself. If it was lighter than a feather, you entered paradise. If heavier, it was devoured by Amit. In Egypt, even death couldn't escape judgment. To live without honor meant eternal extinction. No afterlife. No name. Nothing. It was the ultimate punishment, to be forgotten. And yet, the people accepted it. They built their lives around it. They believed that pain purified, and obedience preserved the cosmic order. Because in a world where gods ruled kings, and kings ruled lives, law was never about fairness. It was about balance, no matter how much blood it required. In Babylon, justice was fear. In Egypt, it was faith, and both demanded the same price. Your life. As centuries passed, these laws spread through Persia, Greece, and finally to Rome. Each empire would inherit the same belief, that justice must be seen, and punishment must be public. Because fear, once planted in the heart of man, can rule longer than any king. And in Rome, justice became a spectacle. Rome didn't just rule the world. It ruled the human soul through fear, through blood, and through law. When the Roman Republic rose from the ashes of its kings, it promised something different. Law, not tyranny. They called it lex, and carved it into the 12 tables. 12 bronze slabs placed in the forum, where every citizen could read them. It was supposed to be equality before the law. But equality in Rome was a myth. If a patrician struck down a slave, it was discipline. If a slave struck a patrician, it was rebellion, punishable by crucifixion. For Rome, order was sacred, but order came from fear. Every punishment, every execution, was meant to remind the crowd that Rome's peace, Pax Romana, was not born from justice, but from obedience. The people didn't rule Rome. They were ruled by the idea of Rome. Justice, in the empire, was a performance, and the stage was the city itself. In the heart of Rome, near the Forum, stood the Basilica Julia, a great marble hall where trials were held. Imagine it. Hundreds of citizens gathered, whispering, wagering, waiting for blood. The accused stood before a magistrate, not a judge of fairness, but of spectacle. Verdicts were often decided not by truth, but by politics, money, and public opinion. If you were poor, your fate was sealed. If you were powerful, you could buy your way out of death. Sometimes, literally. Lawyers called oratores spoke like poets and actors. Performing for the crowd, a good speech could free a murderer. A bad one could doom an innocent man. But even the trial itself wasn't always the end. Sometimes, it was just the opening act. Those condemned were often sent to the Colosseum, to die in front of 50,000 eyes. Their punishment was not to disappear quietly, but to entertain. Rome didn't hide its cruelty. It built monuments to it. Justice in Rome wasn't about truth. It was about control. And control was always public. Each class of Roman society had its own way to die. For nobles, a clean death, decapitation. For soldiers, the sword. For slaves and traitors, crucifixion. Crucifixion was more than execution. It was psychological warfare. A slow public death meant to strip away dignity and identity. Bodies left hanging on roadsides, so travelers would see the cost of defiance. When Spartacus led his slave revolt, 6,000 men were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies rotting under the sun for weeks. Each cross was a sentence. Each corpse, a message. Rome spoke through silence, the silence of the dead. Others met different ends. Some were thrown to beasts, condemned ad basi, lions, tigers, leopards, imported from Africa. The crowd roared as men were torn apart. To them, it was justice served. To the empire, it was unity through fear. The elite called it spectacle, but in truth, it was mass hypnosis. The people believed justice had been done because they saw it, and the blood made it feel real. Many Roman laws sound logical until you read the punishment. The Lex Cornelia de Sicaris punished assassins by being burned alive. The Lex Julia de Adulterius punished adultery by exile or death if politics demanded it. Even the innocent could suffer. If a slave killed his master, even by accident, every slave in the household was executed. Hundreds could die for the crime of one. Why? Because Rome feared rebellion more than injustice. In the empire's eyes, fear was the only law that truly worked. And it wasn't just Rome's poor who bled. When emperors grew paranoid, the law became a blade aimed upward. Under Nero, treason could mean anything. Refusing to praise the emperor, criticizing his music, or dreaming of his death. Senators were ordered to kill themselves. Poets were strangled. Philosophers exiled to deserts and islands. Rome had created a machine of legality so perfect. It could kill anyone, for any reason, and still call it justice. To the Romans, justice wasn't just political, it was divine. They believed every punishment restored cosmic balance. Criminals were impure. Their deaths cleansed the state. Executioners were priests in their own right, their rituals blending blood with faith. Before each public execution, priests would sprinkle salt and wine on the condemned, as if purifying them for sacrifice. Justice wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about purity. When Christians refused to worship Roman gods, they weren't seen as rebels. They were seen as disease. Their punishment was treatment. Thousands were burned, torn apart, or fed to beasts. Not because they had harmed anyone, but because their beliefs challenged Rome's order. Rome called it justice. History calls it madness. As the empire expanded, law became the emperor's weapon. Every ruler could create, bend, or erase laws with a word. Emperor Caligula once declared that new laws would be written so high on marble walls that no one could read them, then punished citizens for breaking them. Domitian created secret police who listened to whispers in taverns. If someone said his name in jest, they vanished before morning. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, used execution as discipline, believing death brought order. Rome had become a place where the law wasn't above man. It was the man, and the man could change at any moment. The result was paranoia, disguised as order. The people no longer obeyed because they believed in justice. They obeyed because they feared the system that no one could see. The truest power Rome ever built wasn't its army. It was its law. The more Rome decayed, the more violent its justice became. The emperors knew the crowd was hungry, and fear was the easiest way to feed them. Trials became shows. Executions became festivals. The line between theater and punishment disappeared. In the Colosseum, criminals were dressed as mythological villains: Prometheus, Icarus, Orpheus, and executed in scripted plays that mimicked the legends. But the deaths were real. A man portraying Icarus would be thrown from a tower. Another, playing Orpheus, would be mauled by lions. The crowd cheered, not realizing they were applauding their own submission. Rome had found the perfect formula: control through spectacle. And in that formula, justice was no longer sacred. It was entertainment. They didn't just kill for order. They killed for applause. But not everyone watched in silence. As the centuries passed, voices began to rise, soft, hidden, dangerous. Philosophers like Seneca and Cicero warned that cruelty corrupts the soul, that a nation built on death would one day die the same way. Their words were banned, their scrolls burned, but their warnings remained like ghosts in marble corridors. Even the crowd began to change. Whispers spread that the games were cursed, that every drop of blood spilled in the arena was staining the empire's soul. And then, the crowds grew quieter. Attendance fell. The applause began to fade. Rome's empire had conquered the world, but lost its humanity. The very system that had made Rome eternal had also made it fragile. When justice becomes a show, truth becomes meaningless. When fear rules, faith dies. By the 4th century, Christianity spread through the empire, preaching mercy instead of punishment. And suddenly, the people began to see the Colosseum for what it was: a graveyard, not a temple. The games ended. The executions slowed, and the once mighty laws of blood and fear crumbled with the empire that created them. Rome fell, not by sword, but by the weight of its own cruelty. The Middle Ages, a time when kingdoms rose and fell like tides, and the church ruled not only the soul, but the body. If you were accused of a crime, your fate wasn't decided by reason, but by God's will, or at least what men claimed was God's will. In the 9th and 10th centuries, across medieval Europe, there existed a strange form of divine judgment, known as trial by ordeal. To the people of the time, this was not madness, it was faith. If you were accused of theft, adultery, witchcraft, or blasphemy, you weren't judged by a jury. You were judged by the elements themselves. You could be forced to plunge your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If your hand healed cleanly within 3 days, God had proven your innocence. If not, you were guilty. Some trials involved walking barefoot over red-hot plowshares, or carrying burning iron for several paces. In other cases, you were thrown into a river, hands and feet bound. If you sank, you were innocent, because the pure water accepted you. If you floated, it meant the water rejected you, and you were guilty. It was a brutal kind of logic, one that turned faith into fear, because everyone knew the innocent often died, and the guilty often lived by sheer luck. But perhaps the cruelest part was the illusion of fairness. Priests would bless the iron or the water before each trial, claiming that God himself would choose who lived. And when you burned or drowned, they'd say it was his will. If you were unlucky enough to live during the Inquisition, justice wasn't just blind, it was merciless. Starting in the 13th century, the church created a network of inquisitors across Europe whose mission was to seek out heresy, any belief or behavior that challenged religious authority. But heresy was a flexible word. It could mean practicing another faith, questioning the church's teachings, or even speaking out against corruption. The accused were often tortured into confession, because a confession, they believed, saved the soul. One of the most infamous devices used was the strapado. Your hands tied behind your back, hoisted by a rope until your shoulders dislocated. Others faced the rack, which tore limbs from sockets as interrogators asked questions calmly, as though this were medicine for the spirit. In some cities, heretics were burned alive, their ashes scattered in rivers to erase their existence. And the crowd, they cheered, because they believed it was righteous that pain purified sin. Then came the witches. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe descended into hysteria, a war not against armies, but against its own women. Across Germany, France, Scotland, and England, tens of thousands of women were accused of witchcraft. Some were healers, some were widows, some were simply too outspoken. They were tortured until they confessed to impossible things, flying at night, dancing with demons, cursing crops. Once they confessed, the sentence was inevitable: death. The methods varied. In England, they were hanged. In Germany, burned alive. In Scotland, drowned. Each trial followed the same cruel logic. If you survived the torture, you were guilty. If you died, you were innocent, but already gone. One of the most chilling cases occurred in Wurzburg, Germany, in the 1620s. A single accusation spiraled into a frenzy. Within a few years, over 900 people were executed for witchcraft, including children as young as 10, all for the illusion of purity. Royal justice in medieval Europe was no less gruesome, just more theatrical. Kings believed punishment should be a lesson to the masses. Crime, in their eyes, wasn't just a violation of law, it was a challenge to royal authority. So the punishments had to be unforgettable. In France, traitors were drawn and quartered, tied to horses and ripped apart in the public square. In England, thieves had their hands or ears cut off. In Scotland, disembowelment was performed while the victim was still alive. And through it all, crowds gathered to watch, to laugh, to cheer, to be entertained by death. In a dark way, it was a continuation of the Roman Colosseum, except this time, the emperor wore a crown and called it justice. But some kings took cruelty to almost ritualistic extremes. Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia, modern Romania, didn't just punish, he staged horror. He impaled enemies, criminals, and even beggars on wooden stakes, lining entire roads with their bodies. The message was simple: fear is order. To his people, he was both monster and hero, the perfect paradox of medieval power. There was a punishment in medieval Germany known as the Iron Crown. If you betrayed your oath to the king, you would be placed in an iron band heated and it would be clamped around your head like a crown. It symbolized the mockery of royalty and the agony of betrayal. Witnesses said the smell of burning flesh filled the air, mingling with the sound of prayers and screams. Some executions were carried out during festivals, so that punishment and entertainment became indistinguishable. In Nuremberg, a man once cried out, "If this is justice, then hell is merciful." No one disagreed, but no one dared to say it aloud. What made these laws even darker wasn't just their brutality, it was their inequality. If a noble committed a crime, he might pay a fine, or spend a few days in a private cell. If a peasant did the same, he could lose his life. A king could execute at will. A farmer could be executed for stealing bread. Justice, in essence, was not about what you did, but who you were. In some medieval cities, there were even humiliation punishments. Criminals were paraded through the streets in cages, forced to wear masks of iron shaped like animals or devils. The goal wasn't rehabilitation. It was humiliation to erase dignity itself. And for women, the laws were even worse. Adultery, for a man, could mean a fine. For a woman, it meant death. Honor, they said, belonged to the husband. Her life was merely his possession. As centuries passed, Europe began to speak of progress, of enlightenment. But the shadows of these laws lingered. Silent ghosts, haunting every courtroom and prison. People began to question, what if justice itself was the crime? Philosophers like Voltaire and Montesquieu began to write against torture, calling it a machine of lies. They argued that confession under pain wasn't truth, it was survival. And slowly, the flames began to fade. But for hundreds of years, countless people, men, women, and children had already burned, drowned, and bled under the name of justice. And for everyone remembered, 100 more disappeared into the silence of history. The Middle Ages proved one terrifying truth. When laws are written by fear, justice becomes another form of cruelty. From the fire of the ordeals to the screams of the witches, from the throne rooms of kings to the cathedrals of faith, justice became theater. Pain became policy, and death became holy. Yet the strangest part isn't that these laws existed. It's that people believed in them. They believed they were right. And that belief, not the swords, not the fire, was the most terrifying weapon of all. In the East, justice wasn't always about fear. Sometimes, it was about honor. But that honor could be sharper than any sword, and colder than any blade of law. From the dynasties of China to the shogunates of Japan, and the empires of the Ottoman world, death wasn't just punishment, it was purification. For thousands of years, China built its civilization on the belief in cosmic order, the mandate of heaven. Every emperor claimed to rule by divine right, and maintaining harmony between heaven and earth was his sacred duty. When harmony was broken, punishment wasn't just necessary, it was divine. During the Qin dynasty 221–206 BC, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, unified China under one law, but it was a law carved in fear. His legalist code declared that loyalty to the state was absolute, and disobedience was treason. If one man committed a crime, his entire family could be executed. If a soldier deserted, his village could be destroyed. Even minor mistakes, forgetting to report a theft, losing a government tool, or criticizing an official could mean death. The punishment that terrified all was the 5 punishments. 1. Tattooing the face marking for life. 2. Cutting off the nose. 3. Amputating feet. 4. Castration. 5. Execution, often by beheading or slow death. But the most infamous sentence was linki, death by 1,000 cuts. A slow, ritualistic dismemberment. The body sliced piece by piece, sometimes for hours. The idea wasn't just to kill, but to destroy the spirit, to make the condemned suffer beyond death. Denied peace, even in the afterlife. Witnesses wrote that executioners were trained to keep the victim alive as long as possible, cutting carefully, methodically, almost artistically. And when the final breath came, drums would sound, and the crowd would bow, not in pity, but in reverence to the emperor's justice. In China, justice wasn't blind. It watched everything, and it remembered. In Japan, law took a different form. It was written in the language of honor and duty. For a samurai, the law wasn't enforced by fear of punishment, but by shame. And shame was worse than death. If a samurai failed his master, lost a battle, or brought dishonor upon himself, he was expected to perform seppuku, the ritual suicide by disembowelment. It was both punishment and purification. The act was public, solemn, and poetic. A white robe, a final poem, a short blade, the tantu, and a calm bow to death. An appointed second, the kishi, would then behead the samurai to end his suffering. To refuse seppuku was to live in disgrace, a living ghost, rejected by one's clan and ancestors. Even high-ranking officials ordered to die by the shogun accepted the sentence as an honor, because in their belief, dying with dignity was more just than living in shame. But not all were samurai. For commoners, law under the shogunate was strict and unforgiving. Stealing rice could mean decapitation, arson, crucifixion. Speaking ill of a daimyo, death by fire. In Edo period, Japan, 1603 to 1868, executions became spectacles, and the condemned were sometimes displayed in cages along roadsides to warn the living. Some laws even punished thoughts. Suspicion could be enough for death. And yet, in their poetry, the Japanese called death a falling leaf returning to its tree. It was beautiful, even when it was brutal. While Europe burned witches and China cut traitors into pieces, the Ottoman Empire ruled with elegance and silence. Justice there was invisible, but absolute. The Sultan was seen as the shadow of God on earth, the Padishah, whose word was law, and whose silence was fate. Unlike in Europe, executions in the Ottoman court were carried out quietly, with no blood spilled. When a man was sentenced to death, he wasn't beheaded. He was strangled with a silk cord. This wasn't out of mercy, but symbolism. Blood was sacred, and to spill it in the Sultan's name was forbidden. So executioners wrapped a bowstring of silk around the condemned's neck and pulled gently, firmly, until breath was gone. Sometimes, the condemned were high-ranking officials or princes, men who once dined beside the Sultan himself. Even the royal family wasn't safe. Under the law of fratricide, a new sultan could execute his own brothers to prevent civil war. When Mehmed the Conqueror took the throne in 1451, he declared, "Whoever of my sons succeeds to the throne, it is lawful for him to put his brothers to death, for the order of the world depends on it." Historians estimate that more than 80 Ottoman princes were executed under this law. In the palace, silence was the sound of survival. And behind the golden walls of Topkapi, every shadow whispered the same truth. Power was peace, and peace was bought with blood. Across these Eastern empires, China, Japan, and the Ottoman world, a strange paradox emerged. Their laws were both civilized and merciless. They valued order, discipline, and loyalty, but demanded blood to preserve it. Their cruelty wasn't chaos. It was structured, ceremonial, almost sacred. In the West, punishment was loud, fire, iron, and spectacle. In the East, it was quiet, silk cords, blades, and silence. Each believed their justice was the truest. Each believed their cruelty was necessary. But beneath the rituals, poems, and laws, they shared one thing: the belief that the value of life depended on obedience. A single word spoken against the emperor or shogun could erase an entire lineage. A whisper could end a dynasty. And so, people learned to bow not only their heads, but their thoughts. Even in such strict worlds, there were thinkers who questioned this order. In China, Confucian scholars asked, "Can harmony built on fear truly be harmony?" In Japan, poets wrote verses that mourned not the dead, but the silence of the living. One samurai's death poem read, "The sword is sharp, but not as sharp as obedience." And in Istanbul, secret historians chronicled the bloodline of the strangled princes. Though to write such words was treason. But the machine of law rolled on, unshaken. Because law, in these empires, was never meant to serve the people. It was meant to serve order. And order, once sanctified, can justify anything, even death. As centuries passed, the empires changed, but their shadows didn't. Modern laws in Asia began to reject torture, to speak of equality and rights. But the cultural ghosts remained, the reverence for authority, the silence in the face of injustice, the idea that obedience is virtue. Even today, echoes of these ancient laws can be felt, in systems that value control over compassion, silence over truth. The East no longer practices linki or seppuku, or silk strangulation. But the memory of those who died under those laws of honor still lingers. A whisper in every court, a shadow in every sword. The laws of the East reveal a darker paradox: that sometimes the greatest cruelty wears the mask of beauty. A man who died for honor was called noble. A woman who obeyed till death was called virtuous. A ruler who killed his kin was called wise. And the people bowed, believing it all. The truth is that death, once made sacred, becomes seductive. It gives pain meaning. It makes obedience feel righteous. And that is the most dangerous form of law. The one that convinces you it's not cruel at all. In the East, justice didn't shout. It whispered through the steel of the sword, the silence of the silk, and the poetry of death. Every empire that ever lived believed its laws were just. None believed they were cruel. But history remembers differently. By the dawn of the 18th century, the world believed it had become more enlightened. Empires had libraries, universities, and courts. Philosophers spoke of liberty and rights. But in the streets, justice still bled. In Europe, execution had become an art form. In France, the guillotine was invented to be humane. A clean cut. No suffering, no spectacle. But as the blade fell for the first time in 1792, people cheered not for mercy, but for revenge. Crowds gathered daily to watch heads roll into baskets. Vendors sold bread and wine near the scaffold. Mothers lifted children onto their shoulders to see the show. They called it equality before the law. But to the condemned, it was just another stage. Another Colosseum, only made of wood instead of stone. The French Revolution promised justice. What it gave was blood. And in London, justice had another name: Tyburn Tree. A massive wooden gallows stood on the road outside the city. For more than 700 years, it was where England's criminals were taught a lesson. Pickpockets, murderers, rebels, and even children as young as 10, all hung before crowds. It was a festival. Beer flowed. Bets were made. Some fainted. Others sang. A condemned man once joked, "Gentlemen, I'll see you all again, if heaven has a gallows." In those days, execution wasn't punishment. It was entertainment. Discipline and control, all in one. The message never changed. Obey, or you'll hang. While Europe executed its poor, the world beyond its borders suffered under laws that claimed to be civilized. When European powers colonized Africa, Asia, and the Americas, They brought their laws with them, but not their mercy. In the British Empire, native subjects could be whipped, branded, or executed for defying authority, even for gathering in groups, praying differently, or speaking against the crown. In India, under the Raj, local soldiers who refused to obey were tied to cannons and blown apart, a warning written in smoke. In Africa, colonial officers declared entire villages guilty for one man's crime, burning homes, enslaving survivors, calling it justice. And in the Caribbean, the law of slavery was the cruelest of all. A human being could be flogged to death for stealing food. Pregnant women were whipped until their flesh split, and if they died, their owners demanded compensation for the loss of property. Laws, written in polished ink, justified every act. They called it discipline. They called it civil order. But behind those words was a truth older than Babylon. Law was never meant to protect the weak. It was meant to protect the powerful. By the 19th century, law found new tools. More efficient, less bloody, but no less cruel. Prisons replaced gallows. Chains replaced blades. Silence replaced screams. In London, the Newgate prison became a city of shadows. Cells too small for standing, too dark for hope. Inmates starved slowly, not from hunger, but from despair. In America, justice evolved into a factory. The prison system promised reform, but became an industry, turning sentences into labor, and labor into profit. And yet, society applauded, because justice, when hidden behind walls, was easier to believe in. We no longer watch them die, one reformer wrote, but we still need them to suffer. Humanity didn't abandon cruelty, it simply rebranded it. In the modern era, laws still carried echoes of the ancient codes. In the 1950s, some nations still allowed execution by hanging, firing squad, or even public stoning. In parts of the Middle East, thieves lost their hands. In Asia, political dissent was treated as treason. And in the West, justice became tangled in politics, corruption, and fear. But the pattern never changed. Power made the law. The law protected power. Even in countries that abolished the death penalty, new forms of control emerged. Surveillance, propaganda, imprisonment of thought instead of body. Humanity had walked thousands of years since Hammurabi's stone tablet, and yet we still lived under the same principle. Obey or suffer. Today, we look back at the code of Hammurabi, the crucifixions of Rome, the silk cords of the Ottomans, and we call them barbaric. But how different are we, really? We no longer hold public executions, but we broadcast humiliation online. We don't force people into arenas, but we watch suffering as entertainment. We say justice is blind, but we still decide who deserves mercy and who deserves pain. The arenas changed, the crowds didn't. Modern courts still echo with the same cold logic. Someone must pay. And every time a society demands punishment without compassion, every time a crowd cheers for vengeance instead of truth, we become Rome again. We become Babylon. We become every empire that thought justice could exist without empathy. History's most terrifying laws weren't the ones written in stone or scrolls. They were the ones written in silence, in the hearts of people who saw cruelty and called it order. In every civilization, from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the marble halls of Rome, from Kyoto's palaces to London's prisons, there were always those who knew the truth but said nothing. Silence made the gallows. Obedience built the Colosseum. Fear kept the blood flowing. And that silence is still with us. Why did humanity make justice so cruel? Because we wanted order, and order demands sacrifice. Empires learned that fear unites better than love, that death teaches faster than mercy, and that when people are afraid of the law, they will never question the ones who write it. But here lies the great paradox. Every civilization that worshipped law above life eventually destroyed itself. Babylon fell. Rome burned. China's dynasties crumbled. The Ottoman sultans vanished. The gallows in London rotted. Because when law forgets humanity, it forgets its own foundation. Justice without compassion isn't justice at all. It's just another weapon, sharper than any sword, heavier than any crown. Look around the modern world. Cameras in every street, prisons overflowing, wars justified in the name of order. And ask yourself, are we truly more just, or just better at hiding the cruelty? The ancient empires believed they were chosen by gods. Today, we believe we're guided by reason. But both serve the same illusion, that punishment creates peace. Perhaps the real test of civilization is not how well it punishes the guilty, but how it protects the powerless. Because if justice can't show mercy, then it's just another form of tyranny. Once, we carved laws into stone. Now, we write them in code, but the soul behind them remains unchanged. From the Hammurabi tablet to the digital courtroom, from crucifixion to confinement, humanity has always chased justice, but often found vengeance instead. And maybe that's what the ancients tried to warn us. That true justice can never be found in fear or in law. It can only be found in humanity. The scariest laws in history weren't the ones that killed the guilty. They were the ones that made the innocent believe it was right. So the next time you walk past a courthouse, a police station, or a prison, remember the shadows beneath their foundations. They were built on every stone that once bore the weight of a body, every scroll that justified pain, every silence that became consent. The ghosts of justice are everywhere. They whisper not in blood, but in memory. And they ask the same question history has never answered. Have we learned anything at all?